London, 1829. The season had descended upon London with all its customary splendour, transforming the city into a glittering stage where fortunes were won, reputations made, and hearts irrevocably altered. The grand ballrooms of Mayfair blazed with candlelight, their crystal chandeliers casting dancing shadows upon silk-clad shoulders and jewelled throats. In drawing-rooms scented with hothouse roses, ambitious mummers plotted marriages, while their daughters practiced their curtsies and perfected their smiles. It was a world of exquisite manners and hidden passions, where a single glance could convey what words dared not speak, and where the most powerful man in the realm was about to discover that not everything could be conquered by title alone. Alexander Worthington, the Duke of Ashford, stood at the entrance of Lady Pemberton's ballroom with the casual arrogance of a man who had never been denied anything he truly desired. At 29, he possessed that rare combination of aristocratic breeding and masculine vitality that made matrons sigh and debutantes swoon. His dark hair gleamed in the candlelight, swept back from a face that might have been carved by a master sculptor, all strong lines and aristocratic planes, saved from severity by a mouth that suggested both sensuality and sardonic humour. His evening clothes were impeccably tailored, the black superfine coat sitting perfectly across shoulders, broadened by years of fencing and riding. He wore his consequence as naturally as he wore his signet ring, a man entirely comfortable in his dominion over society. "Your Grace," Lady Pemberton herself rushed forward, her ample bosom heaving with excitement beneath her purple silk gown. "What an honour! We had not dared hope you would attend this evening." It was no secret that the Duke of Ashford was notoriously selective about his social engagements. His presence at any gathering elevated it from merely fashionable to absolutely essential. Already he could see heads turning, fans fluttering faster, as whispers rippled through the assembled company like wind across a wheat field. "Lady Pemberton, you are too kind," he replied with practiced courtesy, though his eyes were already scanning the room with the predatory interest of a man accustomed to selecting his quarry. The ballroom was crowded with the usual collection of hopeful debutantes, each one dressed in the obligatory white or palest pastels, their faces alight with the desperate hope that this might be the evening their fortunes changed. He had seen it all before, the calculating glances of mothers, the simpering smiles of daughters who would agree with anything he said, laugh at any jest he made, no matter how poor. It had become tedious, this endless parade of feminine acquiescence. Dear listener, I would like to invite you to like, comment, and subscribe to our channel. If you enjoy our beautiful period romances, it helps us continue bringing quality entertainment to you. The orchestra struck up a waltz, and the Duke was preparing to make his excuses to Lady Pemberton, when something caught his eye, or rather someone. Standing near the far windows, partially obscured by a marble column, was a young woman unlike any he had seen in years of attending such gatherings. She was not watching him, which was itself extraordinary. While every other female in the room had positioned herself for maximum visibility to his grace, this woman seemed entirely absorbed in conversation with an elderly gentleman whom the Duke recognized as Sir Edmund Hartley, a noted scholar of antiquities. She wore a gown of deep sapphire blue that should have been scandalous on an unmarried woman. Propriety demanded pastels, yet somehow she carried it with such natural grace that it seemed perfectly appropriate. Her dark hair was dressed simply, without the elaborate ringlets and ornaments currently in fashion, swept up to reveal a slender neck and shoulders that gleamed like pearl in the candlelight. But it was not her beauty that arrested him, considerable though it was. It was something in her bearing, a quality of self-possession that suggested she would be perfectly content if every other person in the room simply vanished. She laughed at something Sir Edmund said, a genuine laugh that reached her eyes, and the Duke found himself moving toward her without conscious decision, drawn by something he could not name and would not have believed possible an hour earlier. "Sir Edmund," he said smoothly, arriving at the older man's elbow, "I trust you are well this evening?" The scholar turned, his weathered face breaking into a pleased smile. "Your Grace, what a delightful surprise. I was just discussing the recent discoveries at Herculaneum with Miss Ashworth here. May I have the honour of presenting Miss Beatrice Ashworth?" "Miss Ashworth, His Grace, the Duke of Ashford." The young woman turned to face him fully for the first time, and the Duke felt something shift in his chest, a sensation so unfamiliar that it took him a moment to identify it as genuine interest. She did not blush or simper. She did not flutter her fan or drop her eyes with affected modesty. Instead, she regarded him with calm, intelligent eyes of an unusual grey-green colour, and executed a curtsy that was perfectly correct, yet somehow managed to convey that she was performing it out of social obligation rather than awe at his consequence. "Your Grace," she said, her voice low and musical, with just a hint of something that might have been amusement. "How fortunate for Sir Edmund that you share his passion for Italian antiquities. So few gentlemen of fashion concern themselves with such scholarly pursuits." There was something in her tone, the merest suggestion that she doubted the sincerity of his interest, that both irritated and intrigued him. "I confess I am a mere amateur compared to Sir Edmund's vast knowledge," he replied, deploying the smile that usually rendered women speechless. "But I find the subject fascinating. The ancients understood so much that we moderns have forgotten." "Indeed." She tilted her head slightly, studying him as one might study a curious artifact in a museum. "And which aspects of classical learning do you find most compelling, Your Grace? The philosophy, the architecture, the military strategies, or perhaps the more, shall we say, recreational pursuits for which certain Roman emperors were notorious?" Sir Edmund choked slightly on his champagne, but Miss Ashworth's expression remained serenely innocent, though her eyes sparkled with unmistakable mischief. The Duke realized with a shock that she was deliberately baiting him, testing whether he possessed actual knowledge or merely pretended interest to make conversation with her. It was so unexpected, so refreshing after years of feminine deference, that he found himself genuinely smiling for the first time that evening. "I find the philosophy most rewarding," he said, deciding to rise to her challenge. "Marcus Aurelius in particular. His reflections on the nature of power and responsibility seem especially relevant for those of us who inherit authority rather than earning it." He paused deliberately. "Though I confess I also appreciate Ovid, particularly the Metamorphoses, there is something compelling about stories of transformation, of people becoming something other than what they were born to be." He saw the flash of surprise in her eyes, quickly masked but unmistakable. She had expected him to fumble or retreat into generalities. Instead, he had demonstrated not only knowledge but the ability to think beyond the surface of things. The slight nod she gave him was worth more than 1,000 sighs from other women. "The Metamorphoses," she said thoughtfully. "Yes, a fascinating work, though I have always found Ovid's treatment of female characters somewhat troubling. So many transformations undertaken not by choice, but as escape from unwanted masculine attention. Daphne becoming a laurel tree to flee Apollo, for instance. One might argue that Ovid was offering commentary on the abuse of power rather than celebrating it. One might indeed, the Duke agreed, genuinely delighted now, and one would be correct to do so. Perhaps that is why the work remains relevant, because the dynamics of power and its potential for abuse are as pertinent in a London ballroom as they were in ancient Rome." "How very philosophical of you, Your Grace," Miss Ashworth replied, and this time there was no mistaking the warmth in her tone. "I confess I did not expect to discuss classical literature this evening. Most gentlemen seem to believe that young ladies prefer to discuss nothing more challenging than the weather or the latest fashions." "Then most gentlemen are fools," he said bluntly, earning a delighted laugh from Sir Edmund. "Though in fairness to my sex, many young ladies do seem to prefer such topics, or at least pretend to. It becomes difficult to distinguish between genuine preference and performance. That, Your Grace, is the essential problem with a society that insists women must make themselves pleasing rather than interesting," she said, her eyes meeting his directly. "When one is constantly performing, authenticity becomes impossible. But I suspect you understand something of that burden yourself. A duke must also perform, must he not? Always conscious of being watched, judged, measured against the expectations of your rank." It was such an unexpected observation, cutting so close to thoughts he rarely acknowledged even to himself, that the Duke found himself momentarily speechless. Before he could formulate a response, the music changed, and he heard himself asking, "Would you do me the honor of this dance, Miss Ashworth?" Something flickered across her face. Was it reluctance? "You are very kind, Your Grace, but I was just about to retire to the refreshment room. The evening has grown rather warm." It was a polite refusal, and for a moment the Duke simply stared at her, unable to process what had just occurred. In 7 years of attending society functions, no woman had ever declined his invitation to dance. Ever. The refusal was so unprecedented that he wondered briefly if he had misheard. "Then perhaps I might escort you," he suggested, recovering his composure. "I confess I could also benefit from some refreshment." "How thoughtful but unnecessary," she replied with a smile that was perfectly pleasant, yet somehow managed to be dismissive. "Sir Edmund has promised to show me his sketches from his recent travels. I would not wish to keep you from your other obligations, Your Grace. I'm quite certain there are many young ladies hoping for the honor of dancing with you." And with that, she curtsied again and allowed Sir Edmund to escort her toward the refreshment room, leaving the Duke of Ashford standing alone in the middle of Lady Pemberton's ballroom, watching her retreat with a mixture of disbelief and growing fascination. "Well," murmured Lord Thornbury, appearing at his elbow with barely suppressed mirth, "that was remarkably entertaining. The great Duke of Ashford refused by a woman. I never thought I would live to see the day." "Who is she?" the Duke asked, his eyes still following the sapphire gown as it disappeared through the doorway. "Truly, I mean, what is her situation?" Thornbury, who made it his business to know everyone's situation, was happy to oblige. "Miss Beatrice Ashworth, only daughter of the late Baron Ashworth. Father died 2 years ago, left her quite comfortably situated. Not an immense fortune, mind you, but enough that she needn't marry for money. She lives with her aunt, Lady Catherine Ashworth, in a respectable house in Bedford Square. This is her 3rd season, which makes her practically a veteran of the marriage market. Rumour has it she's refused at least a dozen offers, including one from Viscount Weatherby." "Weatherby?" The Duke frowned. The Viscount was considered an excellent catch, handsome, wealthy, with an unblemished reputation. "Why would she refuse him?" "Apparently she found him boring," Thornbury said with a grin. "According to my sister, who is friendly with Miss Ashworth, the young lady has rather exacting standards. She claims she will not marry merely for position or wealth, but only for genuine regard and intellectual compatibility. Quite the romantic for someone so obviously practical in every other regard." The Duke barely heard the last part. His entire attention was focused on the doorway through which Miss Ashworth had vanished. Something had awakened in him, something he had not felt in years, perhaps had never truly felt. The thrill of a genuine challenge, the intrigue of an unsolved puzzle, the irresistible lure of something that could not be easily obtained. "I am going to marry her," he said quietly, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. Thornbury choked on his champagne. "I beg your pardon? You've known her all of 10 minutes, most of which she spent subtly insulting you, and she just refused to dance with you. Are you feeling quite well?" "Perfectly well," the Duke replied, a slow smile spreading across his face. "In fact, I cannot remember when I have felt better. Excuse me, Thornbury. I suddenly find myself in need of refreshment." He made his way toward the refreshment room with purposeful strides, ignoring the hopeful glances and strategic positioning of various young ladies along his path. The refreshment room was less crowded than the ballroom, offering some relief from the press of bodies and the overwhelming scent of perfume and hothouse flowers. He spotted Miss Ashworth immediately. She stood by a window, still in conversation with Sir Edmund, examining what appeared to be a portfolio of sketches. The Duke approached more cautiously this time, aware that he needed to modify his strategy. Miss Ashworth was clearly not impressed by title or consequence alone. She required something more, substance, perhaps, or genuine interest that went beyond superficial attraction. Very well, he could provide that. In fact, he realized with some surprise, he wanted to provide that. The prospect of an actual conversation with an intelligent woman who would challenge rather than flatter him was more appealing than anything he had experienced in years of social intercourse. "Sir Edmund," he said, arriving at the scholar's side, "I wonder if you might spare me a moment. I have been meaning to consult with you about a matter of some scholarly importance." The older man looked up with interest. "Of course, Your Grace. What matter is that?" "I am considering establishing a fund to support archaeological expeditions to Greece and Italy," the Duke said, the idea forming, even as he spoke, Though once articulated, he realized it was actually an excellent notion, and one he should have considered before. "I understand you have connections with various learned societies, and might advise me on how such a fund could be most effectively structured." Sir Edmund's weathered face lit up with enthusiasm. "Your Grace, what a splendid idea! This is precisely the sort of patronage that is so desperately needed. Yes, I would be honored to assist you in any way possible. Perhaps we might arrange a meeting at your convenience to discuss the details." "Why not now?" the Duke suggested, pulling out a chair at a nearby table. "Unless, of course, we would be interrupting Miss Ashworth's evening." He glanced at her with calculated innocence. "Not at all," Miss Ashworth replied, though her eyes told him she understood perfectly well what he was doing. "I find the prospect of actual scholarship far more engaging than the usual ballroom chatter. By all means, let us discuss your philanthropic ambitions, Your Grace. I am curious to see if they survive contact with specific details and actual financial commitment." There it was again, that subtle challenge, the suggestion that she doubted his sincerity. Rather than irritating him, it only made him more determined to prove himself. They settled at the table, and what followed was one of the most remarkable hours of the Duke's life. What began as a strategy to maintain Miss Ashworth's presence became a genuinely absorbing discussion of classical archaeology, the best methods for preserving ancient artifacts, and the political complications of conducting excavations in territories controlled by the Ottoman Empire. Miss Ashworth, it transpired, was not merely well-read but genuinely scholarly in her interests. She had taught herself ancient Greek and was working her way through Latin, the better to read classical texts in their original languages. She had strong opinions about the proper methods for excavating archaeological sites, opinions that sometimes differed from Sir Edmund's, but were always well-reasoned and supported by evidence. She spoke with passion about the importance of preserving context, of recording exactly where each artifact was found, of treating ancient sites as sources of knowledge rather than merely repositories of treasures to be plundered for private collections. The Duke found himself contributing far more than he had intended, drawing on his own extensive education and his genuine interest in history and philosophy. The conversation ranged from the practical to the theoretical, from discussions of funding mechanisms to debates about the nature of historical knowledge itself. More than once, he and Miss Ashworth found themselves in friendly disagreement, their debate growing animated as they challenged each other's assumptions and pushed back against unsupported assertions. "You argue like a barrister," he said at one point, after she had neatly dismantled his position on the reliability of Herodotus as a historical source. "I shall choose to take that as a compliment," she replied, her eyes sparkling with pleasure, "though I suspect many gentlemen would consider it an insult to a lady's feminine delicacy." "Then many gentlemen are idiots," he said bluntly. "I cannot comprehend why intelligence in a woman should be considered anything other than an asset and a delight." Something shifted in her expression then. The wariness receded slightly, replaced by what might have been cautious approval. "That is a remarkably enlightened perspective, Your Grace. One does not often encounter it among gentlemen of your station." "Perhaps you have been encountering the wrong gentleman," he suggested, holding her gaze. She looked away first, but not before he saw the faint color rise in her cheeks. "Perhaps," she murmured. The evening was growing late when Lady Catherine Ashworth, a formidable woman in her 50s with iron-grey hair and shrewd eyes, appeared to collect her niece. "Beatrice, my dear, we should be departing. The hour grows unseemly late." Miss Ashworth rose immediately, gathering her reticule and shawl. "Of course, Aunt Catherine." She turned to Sir Edmund and curtsied. "Thank you for a most enlightening conversation, sir. I look forward to our continued correspondence on these matters. And you, Your Grace," she said, turning to the Duke with a curtsy that seemed fractionally warmer than her earlier ones. "You have quite surprised me this evening. I confess I did not expect to find such genuine scholarship beneath the facade of a fashionable duke." "I am filled with surprises, Miss Ashworth," he replied, rising and bowing over her hand. "I hope you will allow me the opportunity to reveal more of them to you. Perhaps you would do me the honor of allowing me to call upon you." He felt her hand stiffen slightly in his, and when she withdrew it, her expression had become guarded again. "You are very kind, Your Grace, but I am not receiving calls at present. My time is quite occupied with various pursuits and my studies. I would not wish to waste your valuable time with my tedious schedule." It was another refusal, politely phrased but unmistakable. The Duke felt a flash of frustration. He had spent the entire evening demonstrating that he was more than a superficial aristocrat, that he possessed the intellect and genuine interest she claimed to value, and yet she still held him at arm's length. What more did she require? "Surely your pursuits and studies do not consume every hour of every day," he pressed, more forcefully than he had intended. "One afternoon—" "Cannot be spared, I am afraid," she interrupted gently but firmly. "I do apologize, Your Grace. Perhaps we shall encounter one another again at some future social gathering. Good evening." And before he could formulate another argument, she was gone, her aunt shepherding her toward the exit with the efficiency of a seasoned military commander. The Duke stood watching them go, aware that Sir Edmund was regarding him with poorly concealed amusement. "Do not say it," he warned the older man. "Say what, Your Grace?" Sir Edmund replied innocently. "That Miss Ashworth is possibly the only woman in London who seems entirely immune to your considerable charms, that she appears to find the excavation of Pompeii more interesting than the most eligible bachelor in England. I would not dream of stating such obvious facts." "She is not immune," the Duke said with more confidence than he felt. "She is merely cautious. She has been pursued by fortune hunters and title seekers before, and has learned to protect herself. I simply need to demonstrate that my interest is genuine and not merely passing fancy." "And is it?" Sir Edmund asked shrewdly. "Genuine, I mean. Or are you simply intrigued because she does not fall at your feet like every other woman in London?" It was a fair question, and the Duke considered it carefully before responding. "Both," he admitted finally. "I will not pretend that her indifference is not stimulating. I have grown unutterably bored with simpering acquiescence, but it is more than that, Edmund. She is genuinely intelligent, genuinely passionate about ideas and learning. When was the last time you heard a woman in a London ballroom express a controversial opinion about anything more significant than whether the waltz is too scandalous to be properly danced? She is extraordinary, and I intend to win her." "Then I wish you the best of luck," Sir Edmund said, clapping him on the shoulder. "Though I suspect you will need more than luck. You will need patience, genuine effort, and the willingness to accept that she may never change her mind. Miss Ashworth is not a prize to be won, Your Grace. She is a person with her own desires and ambitions, and those may not include becoming a duchess." The warning was well meant, but the Duke barely heard it. His mind was already racing ahead, planning his next move. If Miss Ashworth would not receive him privately, then he would have to find other ways to demonstrate his sincerity. He would attend every social function where she might appear. He would make himself knowledgeable about the subjects that interested her. He would prove through action rather than words that he was worthy of her attention. What the Duke of Ashford wanted, he obtained. It had always been thus. Miss Beatrice Ashworth would learn that refusing him only made him more determined. The following morning found the Duke in his study at Ashford House, his magnificent Mayfair residence, writing a carefully considered letter to Miss Ashworth. He had already discarded 4 attempts, one too formal, one too casual, one that revealed too much of his feelings, and one that revealed too little. The 5th attempt, after an hour of concentrated effort, struck what he hoped was the right balance. "My dear Miss Ashworth, I write to thank you for the most stimulating conversation I have enjoyed in longer than I can recall. Your insights into the preservation of classical antiquities were both profound and practical, and our discussion has inspired me to move forward with establishing the archaeological fund we discussed. I would be most grateful if you would consent to serve on the advisory committee for this endeavor. Your knowledge and passion for the subject make you ideally suited for such a role, and I can think of no one whose judgment I would value more highly. I remain, with great respect, Ashford." It was, he thought with satisfaction, a perfect letter. It acknowledged their conversation without excessive flattery, offered her a legitimate role that played to her genuine interests rather than her feminine charms, and provided a context for continued interaction that had nothing to do with courtship or marriage. She could hardly refuse without seeming churlish or inconsistent with her stated values. The reply came 3 days later, and it was not what he expected. Your Grace, I am sensible of the honor you do me in suggesting I serve on the advisory committee for your archaeological fund. However, I must respectfully decline. While I am gratified that our conversation inspired such philanthropic ambitions, I cannot help but feel that my involvement would be inappropriate. The world of scholarship and patronage is dominated by gentlemen, and I would not wish my presence to be seen as a distraction or to undermine the serious purpose of the endeavor. I am confident that Sir Edmund and his colleagues will provide you with excellent guidance. I remain respectfully, Miss B. Ashworth. The Duke read the letter 3 times, his frustration mounting with each reading. It was a masterpiece of polite refusal. She had managed to decline without giving him any legitimate grounds for pressing his suit further. She had even turned his own gesture against him, suggesting that his offer might be motivated by gallantry rather than genuine respect for her abilities. It was maddening. It was brilliant. It made him want her even more intensely. Very well. If she would not join his committee, he would find other ways to demonstrate his sincerity. He made inquiries, discreet ones through channels that would not alert Miss Ashworth to his interest, about her activities and interests. It transpired that she was devoted to her studies, spending long hours in her late father's library, reading classical texts. She also had a passion for music and attended concerts regularly. She enjoyed long walks in the parks and had a particular fondness for botanical gardens, where she sketched various specimens. The Duke began to appear at the same concerts she attended, always positioning himself where she would see him, but never approaching too directly. He visited the botanical gardens on the days he knew she would be there, pretending surprise when they encountered each other. He sent her books, carefully selected volumes on subjects they had discussed, always with notes that referenced their conversation and posed thoughtful questions for her consideration. His persistence was both frustrating and flattering to Beatrice. She had meant to keep him at a distance, to protect herself from the inevitable disappointment that came when men proved to be less than they initially appeared. But the Duke was making that strategy increasingly difficult to maintain. His gifts were thoughtful rather than extravagant. His encounters seemed coincidental, but were clearly orchestrated with care. And most importantly, he continued to treat her as an intellectual equal rather than merely a beautiful woman to be pursued. One afternoon in early May, they encountered each other at Kew Gardens. Beatrice was sketching a rare orchid when she heard a familiar voice behind her. "Your attention to detail is remarkable, Miss Ashworth. You have captured not just the form, but the very essence of the flower." She turned to find the Duke standing a respectful distance away, dressed for walking in a dark green coat that brought out the color of his eyes. "Your Grace," she said, rising and executing a curtsy. "What a surprise to find you here." "Is it?" he asked with a slight smile. "I confess I hoped I might encounter you. Your aunt mentioned at Lady Thornbury's musical that you often visit the gardens on Wednesday afternoons." "You spoke with my aunt?" Beatrice asked, surprised and slightly alarmed. "Briefly," he assured her. "I simply inquired about your health and mentioned how much I had enjoyed our conversation at Lady Pemberton's ball. Lady Catherine was kind enough to suggest that we shared similar interests in botanical subjects." He gestured to the path. "Might I walk with you? I promise to be respectful of your time and your preference for solitude." Beatrice hesitated. Every instinct warned her to refuse, to maintain the distance she had so carefully established. But another part of her, a part she had been trying to ignore, wanted to accept. She was lonely, if she was honest with herself. Lonely for intelligent conversation with someone who saw her as more than merely a woman to be married off. The Duke had proven himself capable of such conversation, and she found herself wanting more of it despite her better judgment. "Very well," she said finally, "but only for a quarter hour, Your Grace. I have much work to accomplish this afternoon." "I am grateful for whatever time you can spare," he replied, offering his arm. They walked together through the gardens, and the Duke was true to his word. He asked thoughtful questions about her sketches, listened attentively to her explanations of various botanical specimens, and shared his own observations with genuine enthusiasm. There was none of the forced gallantry she had experienced with other suitors, no attempts to turn every conversation toward flattery or romance. He simply talked with her, as one scholar might converse with another. "You know," he said after they had walked for some time, I've been thinking about our conversation regarding Ovid. You made an excellent point about the problematic nature of his transformations, women fleeing masculine attention only to lose their humanity in the process. It occurs to me that much of classical literature treats women as objects rather than subjects. Surely that represents a significant limitation in our understanding of the ancient world. Beatrice stopped walking and turned to face him fully, studying his expression for any sign of artifice. That is a remarkably perceptive observation, Your Grace. Most scholars dismiss such concerns as modern sentimentality imposed upon ancient texts. They argue that we must accept the ancients on their own terms rather than judging them by contemporary standards. And you disagree? He asked, genuinely curious. I think there is merit in both approaches, she said carefully. We should strive to understand the ancients in their own context, yes, but we should also be willing to critique aspects of their culture that we now recognize as unjust or harmful. Understanding need not preclude judgment, any more than appreciation need preclude criticism. Exactly so, he agreed with evident pleasure. Miss Ashworth, do you realize how rare it is to find someone willing to engage with ideas at this level? Most people I encounter either agree with everything I say out of deference to my rank, or disagree merely to be contrary. You argue from genuine conviction and reasoned analysis. It is refreshing. The color rose in her cheeks at his praise, but she held his gaze steadily. I could say the same of you, Your Grace. I confess I did not expect to find such genuine intellectual curiosity in a duke. Most aristocrats seem content to rest on their titles and leave scholarship to others. Then we have both been pleasantly surprised by each other, he said softly. And there was something in his voice, a warmth and intimacy that made her breath catch. She looked away, suddenly aware of how close they were standing, of the intent way he was looking at her. I should return home, she said, her voice not quite steady. My aunt will worry if I am gone too long. Of course, he said immediately, stepping back to give her space. Thank you for allowing me to walk with you, Miss Ashworth. I hope we might encounter each other again soon. Perhaps, she said non-committally, though they both knew it was not truly a matter of chance. He would arrange to be wherever she was, and despite her better judgment, she found she did not entirely object to the prospect. Over the following weeks, a pattern emerged. They encountered each other at concerts, at galleries, in the parks and gardens. Sometimes they walked together, sometimes they simply conversed briefly before parting. The Duke never pressed for more than she was willing to give, never demanded acknowledgement of the courtship that was clearly taking place, despite her refusal to formally receive him. He was patient in a way she had never expected, persistent without being aggressive, attentive without being suffocating. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, Beatrice felt her defenses beginning to weaken. She found herself looking forward to their encounters, disappointed when several days passed without seeing him. She began to dress with more care on the days she knew he might appear, choosing colors and styles that she thought he might admire. She caught herself thinking about him at odd moments, wondering what he would say about a passage she was reading, imagining how he would respond to an argument she was formulating. It terrified her, this growing attachment. She had sworn she would never allow herself to be vulnerable in this way, would never risk her independence and her sense of self for any man. Yet the Duke seemed to be breaching her defenses without even trying, simply by being consistently thoughtful, genuinely interested, and utterly respectful of her boundaries, even as he gently pushed against them. One evening at a concert at the Hanover Square Rooms, they found themselves seated near each other. Whether by chance or design, Beatrice no longer knew. The soprano was singing a particularly moving aria when she felt the Duke's eyes upon her. She turned her head slightly and found him watching her with an expression of such tender intensity that it took her breath away. In that moment, she realized with absolute certainty that she had fallen in love with him. The knowledge was both exhilarating and terrifying. She had thought herself immune to such feelings, had believed that her intellectual independence would protect her from the vulnerability of romantic attachment. Instead, she had discovered that genuine intellectual connection could be even more seductive than physical attraction, that a man who valued her mind could capture her heart far more thoroughly than one who merely praised her beauty. After the concert, as they stood in the crush of people waiting for their carriages, the Duke drew her slightly aside into a quieter corner of the vestibule. "Miss Ashworth," he said quietly, his voice pitched for her ears alone, "I wonder if you might finally consent to receive me properly. Allow me to call upon you at Bedford Square. Give me the opportunity to court you in the open, rather than through these carefully orchestrated chance encounters." She looked up at him, searching his face, seeing the sincerity in his eyes. "Why?" she asked simply. "Why me, Your Grace? London is full of beautiful women who would be thrilled to receive your attentions. Women who would be far easier to court, who would not challenge you at every turn, who would be grateful for your interest rather than suspicious of it. Why pursue someone who has made it abundantly clear that she does not wish to be pursued?" "Because you are worth pursuing," he said immediately. "Because you challenge me to be better, to think more deeply, to look beyond the surface of things. Because when I am with you, I feel more truly myself than I do in any other company. And because, Beatrice," he used her given name deliberately, watching her eyes widen at the intimacy, "I have fallen completely and irrevocably in love with you, and I cannot imagine spending my life with anyone else." The breath left her lungs in a rush. She had expected many things, but not this. Not such a direct and unequivocal declaration. "You do not know what you're saying," she whispered. "You cannot truly want to marry someone like me. I would argue with you constantly. I would challenge your opinions. I would never be content to simply manage your household and smile prettily at social functions." "I know," he said, taking her hands in his, a boldness given their public location, but he seemed beyond caring about propriety. "That is precisely why I want to marry you. Beatrice, I do not want a conventional duchess. I want you, with all your arguments and challenges and intellectual passions. I want to come home at the end of the day and discuss philosophy with you until we fall asleep mid-debate. I want to watch you pursue your studies and know that I am married to a woman who values knowledge as much as I do. That is the life I want, and I can only have it with you." Tears pricked at her eyes, and she blinked them back furiously. "What if society disapproves? What if I embarrass you with my unconventional behavior?" "Then society can go to the devil," he said fiercely. "Beatrice, you could never embarrass me. You could only make me proud. Please allow me to call upon you properly. Give me the chance to prove that I mean every word I am saying." She wanted to say yes. Every fiber of her being wanted to accept his declaration and his courtship. But fear held her back. Fear of disappointment. Fear of losing herself. Fear of discovering that his interest was merely the thrill of conquest and would fade once she surrendered. "I need time to think," she said finally. "This is all happening so quickly, and I cannot make such an important decision in haste." "Take all the time you need," he assured her, though his eyes showed his disappointment. "I will wait, Beatrice. However long it takes, I will wait for you." That night, Beatrice could not sleep. She paced her bedchamber, wrestling with the decision that would determine the course of her entire life. On one side lay safety, continuing as she was, independent and unattached, free to pursue her studies without interference. On the other lay risk, the possibility of happiness with a man who seemed to understand her, but also the possibility of heartbreak if he proved false. She thought about all the conversations they had shared, all the times he had demonstrated genuine interest in her thoughts rather than merely her appearance. She remembered how he had encouraged her to speak her mind, how he had listened with real attention when she explained her theories about classical texts, how he had sent her books with thoughtful notes rather than jewelry with empty compliments. By dawn, she had made her decision. The following afternoon, the Duke received a note in a feminine hand. "Your Grace, you may call upon me tomorrow at 3 o'clock. I make no promises beyond allowing you the opportunity to present your case. But I confess I am curious to see how you conduct a proper courtship, having become so accustomed to your improper one. Miss B. Ashworth." The Duke read the note 3 times, a smile spreading across his face. It was not an acceptance, but it was permission, and that was more than enough. He arrived at Bedford Square at precisely 3 o'clock the next day, dressed with particular care and carrying a bouquet of lilies and delphiniums. The butler showed him to a pleasant sitting room where Miss Ashworth waited with her aunt. Lady Catherine regarded him with shrewd eyes but said nothing, simply taking up her embroidery and positioning herself by the window, present as propriety demanded, but far enough away to allow private conversation. "Your Grace," Beatrice said, rising to greet him, "thank you for coming." "Thank you for receiving me," he replied, bowing over her hand. "I have brought you these. I hope you do not find them presumptuous." She took the flowers with a genuine smile. "Not at all. They are lovely. You remembered they are my favorites." "I remember everything you have ever told me," he said softly, and watched the color rise in her cheeks. They sat, and for a moment neither spoke. Then the Duke took a deep breath and began. "Miss Ashworth, Beatrice, I know you have doubts about my sincerity. I know you fear that I am pursuing you merely for the novelty of it, and that my interest will fade once the chase is over. I cannot prove those fears unfounded with words alone. But I can tell you with absolute certainty that what I feel for you is unlike anything I have ever experienced. You have changed me, challenged me, made me want to be more than I was, and I believe, I hope, that I might do the same for you." Beatrice studied him carefully, and he bore her scrutiny without flinching. "Tell me," she said finally, "what do you envision for a marriage between us, truly, I mean? Not the romantic ideal, but the practical reality. How would our lives be structured? What would be expected of me as your Duchess?" It was a test, and they both knew it. But the Duke had been prepared for such questions and answered honestly. "I envision a partnership," he said. "You would have responsibilities, yes, managing the household, entertaining when necessary, appearing at certain social functions. But within those constraints, you would have freedom to pursue your own interests. I would not ask you to abandon your studies or your love of learning. In fact, I hope you would share them with me. I imagine us building a library together, hosting salons where scholars and thinkers gather for genuine discourse. I see us traveling to Greece and Italy to see the ancient sites we have discussed. I see us growing old together, still arguing about philosophy, still challenging each other to think more deeply." "And children?" she asked quietly. "What of children?" "I hope we will have them," he said honestly. "An heir is expected, yes, but more than that, I would want to raise children with you, to teach them the values we share, curiosity, compassion, the importance of using one's advantages to benefit others. I think we would make excellent parents together, Beatrice. We would teach our daughters that intelligence is nothing to be ashamed of, and our sons that women deserve respect and partnership rather than subjugation." She was quiet for a long moment, and he could see the war being waged behind her eyes, hope battling with fear, desire fighting against caution. Finally, she spoke. "I am afraid," she said softly. "I am terrified of wanting this, of wanting you, and then discovering that it was all an illusion, that you would eventually grow tired of my unconventional ways and wish you had chosen someone more biddable." "Then let me prove it to you," he said urgently, leaning forward, "not with grand gestures or empty promises, but with time and consistency. Let me court you properly, openly. Let me show you every day in 100 small ways that I mean everything I say. And when you are finally convinced that this is real, that I will never ask you to be anything other than exactly who you are, then, and only then, will I ask you to marry me. Is that fair?" She looked at him for a long moment, and he saw tears gathering in her eyes. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, that is fair. But Alexander, you should know, I am already half in love with you, and it terrifies me." His heart soared at her admission, but he kept his voice calm, gentle. "Then let us be terrified together. I promise you, Beatrice, whatever comes, we will face it side by side." Thus began the most unusual courtship London society had seen in years. The Duke called upon Miss Ashworth regularly, always proper, always respectful of her boundaries, but making his devotion increasingly clear. They walked in the parks, discussing everything from classical philosophy to modern politics. They attended lectures and concerts together, always properly chaperoned but clearly absorbed in each other's company. They exchanged books and long letters debating various scholarly points. Most remarkably, the Duke began to involve Miss Ashworth in his affairs, seeking her advice on the management of certain aspects of his estates, asking her opinion on matters of genuine importance, actually implementing her suggestions when they proved sound. It was unprecedented for a duke to consult with an unmarried woman on such matters, but Alexander cared nothing for precedent. He valued Beatrice's intelligence and judgment, and he wanted her, and society, to see that he truly viewed her as an equal partner. Society predictably had much to say about the unconventional courtship. Some approved, seeing in the Duke's pursuit a genuine affection that transcended mere physical attraction. Others were scandalized, viewing Miss Ashworth as too intellectual, too opinionated, too unsuitable for a duke. The gossip grew so intense that Lady Catherine finally addressed it with her niece one evening. "Beatrice, my dear, you must know that people are talking. They say you are too bookish, too argumentative, that you will make an unsuitable duchess. Some are already predicting that the Duke will tire of you once the novelty wears off." "I know," Beatrice said quietly. "Do you think they are right?" Lady Catherine set down her needlework and looked at her niece with surprising gentleness. "I think the Duke of Ashford is besotted with you in a way I have rarely seen. I think he genuinely values your mind and your spirit. But more importantly, I think you need to decide whether you value his regard enough to brave society's censure. Because, my dear, if you marry him, there will be censure. You will be watched and judged far more closely than any conventional duchess. Are you prepared for that?" Beatrice considered the question carefully. "I think," she said slowly, "that if I have Alexander beside me, truly beside me, as a partner and equal, I can weather any amount of society's disapproval. It is only if I were to face it alone, or worse, with a husband who secretly agreed with the critics, that I would falter." "Then you must be certain of his constancy before you commit yourself," Lady Catherine advised. "Make him prove his devotion beyond any doubt, and only when you are entirely convinced should you accept his suit." It was wise counsel, and Beatrice took it to heart. She continued to hold the Duke at a careful distance, watching him, testing him in subtle ways, and Alexander, with remarkable patience, accepted every test and passed them all. When she deliberately took a controversial position at a dinner party, arguing that women should receive proper education in mathematics and sciences, he supported her publicly, despite the shocked reactions of the other guests. When she expressed interest in attending a lecture at the Royal Society, traditionally closed to women, he used his influence to secure her admission and escorted her there himself, ignoring the disapproving stares. Most tellingly, when his father summoned him for what was clearly meant to be a serious conversation about his choice of bride, Alexander went to the meeting with Beatrice at his side, making it clear that he would not discuss his intended wife behind her back. The Dowager Duke received them in his study, his expression stern. "Alexander, I have been hearing remarkable things about your courtship. It seems you have chosen a most unconventional young lady." "I have chosen an extraordinary woman," Alexander corrected firmly. "Miss Ashworth, may I present my father, the Dowager Duke of Ashford. Father, Miss Beatrice Ashworth." Beatrice curtsied gracefully, meeting the older man's appraising gaze without flinching. "Your Grace, I am honored to make your acquaintance." The Dowager Duke studied her for a long moment before speaking. "Miss Ashworth, my son seems quite determined to marry you, despite the fact that you appear to lack many of the qualities traditionally valued in a duchess. You are outspoken where discretion is expected, intellectual where ornamental would suffice, and controversial where conventional would be far more comfortable. Can you explain to me why I should welcome such a match?" It was a brutal question, but Beatrice answered it calmly. "I cannot, Your Grace. I can only tell you that I love your son, and that I believe I can make him happy, not by conforming to what others expect a duchess to be, but by being a true partner to him. If that is insufficient for your approval, then I am sorry, but I will not pretend to be something I am not." A ghost of a smile flickered across the Dowager Duke's face. "You have spirit. I will grant you that. Very well. Let me ask you this. If you marry my son, you will have considerable responsibilities. Can you fulfill them while maintaining this fierce independence you value so highly?" "I believe I can with Alexander's support," Beatrice replied. "I have no intention of shirking my duties as Duchess, but I also have no intention of abandoning the things that make me who I am. I hope to prove that a woman can be both Dutiful and independent, proper and passionate, a duchess and a scholar. The Dowager Duke was silent for a long moment, then turned to his son. She is nothing like what I would have chosen for you, but I can see that she makes you happy, and that you make each other better. You have my blessing, though I reserve the right to say, I told you so, if this unconventional marriage proves difficult. I will accept that bargain gladly, Alexander said, clasping his father's hand. As they left the Dowager Duke's residence, Beatrice felt something loosen in her chest, a knot of anxiety she had not even realized she was carrying. He approved of me, she said wonderingly. I did not expect that. He is a shrewd judge of character, Alexander replied. He sees what I see, that you are extraordinary, and that together we will be even better than we are apart. The moment had come. Standing on the steps of the Dowager Duke's residence, with the afternoon sun gilding the London streets with gold, Beatrice finally allowed herself to acknowledge what she had been denying for weeks. She was in love with Alexander Worthington, Duke of Ashford, completely, irrevocably, terrifyingly in love. And more than that, she trusted him, trusted that he meant what he said, that his regard was genuine, that he would stand beside her through whatever challenges came. Alexander, she said softly, turning to face him, take me home. I think it is time we had a serious conversation. They rode to Bedford Square in charged silence, both aware that something momentous was about to occur. Lady Catherine, with the discretion that had endeared her to her niece, excused herself shortly after their arrival, leaving them alone in the sitting-room. Beatrice, Alexander began, but she held up a hand to stop him. Let me speak first, she said. I have been unfair to you. I have held you at a distance, tested you at every turn, demanded that you prove yourself again and again when you had already demonstrated your sincerity dozens of times over. I did this because I was afraid of wanting something so much and then losing it, afraid of being vulnerable, afraid that love would mean the loss of myself. She paused, gathering her courage, then continued. But you have shown me that I was wrong. That love, true love, the kind based on mutual respect and genuine partnership, does not diminish either person. It elevates both. You have made me braver, Alexander. You have made me believe that I can have both independence and companionship, both intellectual freedom and romantic love. And so I am ready to stop testing you and start trusting you. I am ready to say yes. Yes? He repeated, hardly daring to breathe. Yes, I will marry you, she said, smiling through the tears that were now streaming down her face. Yes, I will be your duchess and your partner, and your equal. Yes, I will spend my life arguing with you about philosophy and exploring ancient ruins and building something extraordinary together. Yes to all of it, Alexander. Yes. He closed the distance between them in 2 strides and pulled her into his arms, claiming her lips in a kiss that was both tender and passionate, a perfect expression of everything they felt for each other. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. I love you, he whispered. I will spend every day of my life proving that this was the right decision. You will never regret choosing me, Beatrice. I swear it. I know, she replied softly. I already know. The announcement of their engagement caused exactly the sensation they had anticipated. The newspapers were full of it, some celebrating the match as a triumph of genuine affection, others denouncing it as the ruin of one of England's most distinguished ducal lines. Society divided into camps, and for several weeks there was no more discussed topic in London's drawing rooms than the Duke of Ashford's controversial choice of bride. But Alexander and Beatrice barely noticed the gossip. They were too absorbed in each other, in planning their future together, in the joy of finally being able to openly acknowledge their feelings. They spent their days together, walking, talking, laughing, arguing about everything and nothing. The Duke introduced Beatrice to his friends and associates, making it clear that her opinions were to be valued and her presence welcomed. Beatrice, in turn, began to embrace the idea of becoming a duchess, seeing it not as a loss of identity, but as an opportunity to use her position for good. One evening, several weeks after their engagement, They attended a ball at Thornbury House. As they stood together on the edge of the dance floor, Alexander's father approached them. The Dowager Duke had been observing his son's relationship with growing interest, and tonight he had something to say. Meu filho, Londres está cheia de moças lindas que dariam tudo para se casar com você. Por que ela? Alexander smiled and looked at Beatrice, who was engaged in animated conversation with Sir Edmund about some recent archaeological discovery. Porque nenhuma mulher me faz sentir como ela, papai. Ao lado dela, sinto que posso fazer qualquer coisa. The Dowager Duke followed his son's gaze and nodded slowly. I understand, he said quietly. Your mother made me feel the same way. You have chosen well, my son. The wedding took place in October at St. George's, Hanover Square. Despite the controversy surrounding their engagement, the church was packed with well-wishers, scholars mixing with aristocrats, friends from all walks of life gathered to celebrate this most unusual union. Beatrice walked down the aisle in a gown of ivory silk, carrying lilies and delphiniums, her face radiant with happiness. When it came time for the vows, they spoke the traditional words, but Alexander added a promise of his own. I vow to be your partner in all things, he said, holding her hands and looking into her eyes, to support your passions and respect your independence, to challenge you and encourage you, to build with you a life of meaning and purpose. This I promise before God and all these witnesses. Beatrice's eyes filled with tears as she responded. And I vow to stand beside you as an equal, she said, to share with you my thoughts and dreams, to argue with you and laugh with you, to create with you a partnership that honors both of us. This I promise with all my heart. When the vicar pronounced them man and wife, and Alexander kissed his duchess for the first time in public, the church erupted in applause, highly improper according to traditional standards, but somehow perfect for this most unconventional of marriages. The years that followed proved the wisdom of their choice. Alexander and Beatrice built a life together that was both deeply romantic and intellectually fulfilling. They established a magnificent library at Ashford House, hosting regular gatherings where scholars and thinkers met for genuine discourse. They traveled extensively, visiting the ancient sites they had discussed during their courtship. They managed the estates together, with Beatrice proving to have excellent judgment and administrative skills that complemented her husband's strengths. Most importantly, they remained partners in the truest sense. They argued frequently about everything from philosophy to estate management, but their arguments were spirited rather than bitter, motivated by mutual desire to reach the best conclusions rather than to dominate each other. They challenged one another constantly, pushing each other to think more deeply, to consider perspectives they might otherwise have missed, and through it all, they loved each other with a devotion that only grew stronger with time. They had 4 children, 2 sons and 2 daughters, who were raised in an atmosphere of intellectual curiosity and mutual respect. The children watched their parents debate complex ideas at the dinner table and learned that disagreement need not mean disrespect. They saw their mother treated as an equal partner in all matters and learned that women were just as capable of serious thought as men. They observed their father supporting their mother's scholarly pursuits and learned that true strength lay in lifting others up rather than holding them down. On their 10th wedding anniversary, they hosted a small dinner party at Ashford House for their closest friends. After the guests had departed and the children were in bed, Alexander and Beatrice stood together in the library, looking out at the moonlit gardens. Do you remember, Alexander said softly, that first night at Lady Pemberton's ball, when you refused to dance with me? Beatrice laughed. How could I forget? I was so determined to dislike you, so certain that you were just another arrogant aristocrat who wanted a pretty ornament rather than a real partner. And I was so arrogant, he admitted ruefully. I thought I could simply decide to marry you, and you would fall into line like every other woman I had ever pursued. You taught me so much about humility and genuine effort. She turned in his arms to face him, reaching up to cup his cheek. You taught me something too. You taught me that it was possible to be loved for exactly who I am, without pretense or performance. That was a gift beyond price, Alexander. We have taught each other many things over the years, he said, kissing her softly, and I look forward to many more years of mutual education. Even when I argue with you about everything? She teased. Especially when you argue with me about everything, he assured her. A life without intellectual challenge would be unutterably boring. I would far rather spend my days debating with you than agreeing with someone less interesting. She laughed, that genuine, unguarded laugh that still had the power to make his heart soar. Then, I shall endeavor to keep arguing with you for the next 50 years at least. Promise? He asked, his eyes twinkling. Promise, she replied solemnly, then kissed him again. Years continued to pass, and their love only deepened. They grew older together, their hair silvering, their faces acquiring the lines that come from a lifetime of laughter and passionate debate. Their children grew and married, bringing grandchildren who delighted in their grandmother's stories of ancient Rome and their grandfather's tales of archaeological adventures. London society, which had once been scandalized by their unconventional marriage, gradually came to view them as a model couple. Other young people, inspired by their example, began to seek partnerships based on genuine compatibility rather than merely advantageous connections. The world did not change overnight, but it changed slowly and steadily, in part because two people had dared to build a life together on their own terms. On the night of their 25th wedding anniversary, they returned to Kew Gardens, where they had once walked together during their courtship. They stood in the same spot where Alexander had first asked to court Beatrice properly, looking up at the stars. "Do you remember what I said to you here?" Alexander asked, taking her hand. "You said many things," Beatrice replied with a smile, "but I remember most clearly when you said you wanted a partner, not a conventional wife. That you wanted to debate philosophy until you fell asleep mid-argument. And we have done exactly that, haven't we?" he said with satisfaction, "though I confess the arguments are often more interesting than the sleep." She laughed and squeezed his hand. "Alexander, if I could go back to that ballroom and do it all again, I would not change a single moment. Every argument, every challenge, every time I refused you or tested you, all of it led us here, to this life we have built together. You are still the most extraordinary man I have ever known, and I am still as much in love with you as I was that day when I finally agreed to marry you. And you, Beatrice Worthington, are still the most brilliant, infuriating, wonderful woman I have ever met," he replied, turning to face her fully. "You wore down my arrogance not through submission, but through being so completely yourself that I could not help but be changed by knowing you. You showed me what real partnership looks like, and I am grateful for it every day." They kissed there under the stars, two people who had found in each other something rare and precious, a love that did not demand conformity but celebrated authenticity, a partnership that made both of them better than they could have been alone, a marriage that had become a testament to what was possible when two people truly saw each other as equals. And if their story inspired others to seek the same kind of partnership, to value substance over superficiality, authenticity over performance, then that was perhaps their greatest legacy, the proof that love, when built on a foundation of mutual respect and genuine affection, could transform not just two lives but ripple outward to touch countless others. As they walked back through the gardens hand in hand, Beatrice thought about that frightened young woman who had been so certain that marriage would mean the end of everything she valued. How wrong she had been. Marriage to Alexander had not been an ending but a beginning, the start of an adventure that had exceeded every hope and dream she had barely dared to have. "What are you thinking about?" Alexander asked, noticing her contemplative expression. "I am thinking," she said slowly, "that I am very glad I did not succeed in keeping you at a distance. My life would have been so much smaller, so much less joyful without you in it." "Then we are in agreement for once," he teased, and she laughed and kissed him again there under the stars, still in love after all these years, still partners in every sense of the word. And somewhere in London, in drawing rooms and ballrooms, young women were hearing their story and thinking that perhaps, just perhaps, it was possible to have both love and independence, both marriage and identity, both partnership and selfhood. Perhaps it was possible to find someone who valued your mind as much as your beauty, your character as much as your connections, your authentic self as much as any performance. The Duke and Duchess of Ashford had shown that such love was possible, and in doing so, they had given hope to everyone who yearned for something more than society's conventional offerings. Hope that somewhere out there was a person who would see them truly, love them wholly, and walk beside them as an equal partner through all the adventures life had to offer. It was a beautiful legacy for two people who had started their acquaintance with resistance and refusal, who had argued their way into love, and who had built a marriage that proved that the best partnerships are not about one person submitting to another, but about two people choosing to stand together, facing the world side by side, making each other braver, wiser, and more fully themselves than they ever could have been alone. And they lived, not in fairy tale perfection, but in the rich, complex, deeply satisfying reality of a love built on truth, a partnership that honored both individuals while creating something greater than either could have achieved alone. They lived with passion and purpose, with debate and devotion, with challenge and commitment. They lived, in short, exactly as they had promised each other they would, as equals, as partners, as two souls who had found in each other the perfect complement, the ideal companion for life's grand adventure. The end. A love story of pride, desire, and a partnership that changed not only two hearts, but an entire society, proving that the greatest romance is found when two people dare to be authentically themselves and build something extraordinary together. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this emotional journey. If this story touched your heart, we invite you to subscribe, like, comment, and share our channel. Your support inspires us to keep creating more stories of love, redemption, and breathtaking twists. Help us reach our first 1,000 subscribers, and together we'll continue sharing tales that warm the heart. At the end of this video, you'll see a suggestion for another of our historical stories. Click and let yourself be enchanted by another unforgettable tale. With all our gratitude, echoes of romance.